The war in Ukraine, the rise of AI, the climate crisis. Our world is facing new and more complicated challenges every day.
And I think that it's life and death at this point.
Here at Foreign Policy, we take the world's biggest problems and we identify solutions. So join us on Global Reboot, where we hear from the smartest thinkers and doers around.
You need a whole of society approach to determine what civic engagement looks like in the age of exponential propaganda, when there is no shared space, when people question the facts. What's our weapon of choice? Journalism. Shine the light. Demand accountability.
I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. Check out Global Reboot in partnership with the Doha Forum, wherever you get your podcasts.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Foreign Policy Editor-in-Chief, Ravi Agrawal.
All right. Hi, everyone. We made it. Thank you for coming here. I know that each of you probably have 3 or 4 other invitations this evening, so it's UNGA Week. I'm grateful that you've chosen here and FP and Global Reboot. Thank you for coming. Thank you also to the people who are watching us on live stream around the world. So good day. Happy Thursday to you wherever you are. I would like to thank the Bush School at Texas A&M University for partnering with us on this event here today and the reception that follows. Thank you over there. And also Doha Forum, which for those of you who don't know is a terrific annual summit held in Qatar that discusses global affairs, looks for solutions, and they are our partner on this podcast, Global Reboot. Now, you saw that little clip right now about Global Reboot, but let me tell you a little bit more about why we have a podcast called Global Reboot. And I've been thinking about this a lot over the last 3 or 4 years. This is season 3 that we're just about to kick off. And, you know, during the pandemic, it was so clear that the world was in the middle of this big, giant global problem. And at the start of it, we were all feeling like this problem affects us all. This is the thing that affects each and every one of us. And in the beginning, it felt weirdly unifying. But very quickly, we realized that this was not very unifying, that the pandemic in many ways divided all of us. So if you were rich, you would have better chances of success. If you lived in the global north or the west, you would have access to vaccines sooner than people in the global south or the east did. We were very divided. The world was very divided. And that led us to think about, through this podcast, Global Reboot, how do we think about solutions, not just to something like vaccine equity or pandemics, but to other bigger problems that need a big reboot. So, for example, we thought about climate change and climate financing. And for that, we spoke to U.S. climate envoy John Kerry. You probably saw a clip of Maria Ressa, the Nobel Prize winner. We spoke to her about rebooting press freedom. Ertharin Cousin, who used to run the World Food Organization, we spoke to her about rebooting the global food crisis, and so on and so forth. In each of these episodes on Global Reboot, the question that I found myself asking the most, and if you've listened to the podcast, you will know this, and that question is, but how? This is also, as an editor, when I edit people's pieces, it's the query that I have the most often, because it's very easy to begin to imagine solutions, but then when you sort of scratch beneath the surface and you look for details, the thing you find yourself asking again and again and again is, but how? This reminds me of a 5-year-old friend I have who 5-year-old, yeah, that wasn't a mistake. His favorite thing to say is, but why? So you say, hey, time to go to sleep. He'll say, but why? Well, because you'll feel better. But why? And I feel like I've become that guy who now says, but how? About every single thing. But it's a very important question to ask. Now, not anyone, not just anyone, can be a guest on this show. It really needs to be someone who understands an issue very deeply and is able to think through solutions in great detail. And as I was thinking through who we should invite and which issue we should now look to reboot, we thought about the global refugee crisis. And I'm sure you all know this. No one chooses to be a refugee. And yet there are more than 100 million globally displaced people. There are more than 35 million refugees around the world. And when we think of other big global problems, whether it's climate change, whether it's conflict, whether it's political crises, each of these things ends up creating more globally displaced people, and it kind of builds on that global refugee problem that we have. So how do we fix it? It's a really important issue to discuss. And one of the organizations that is knee-deep in thinking about this is the UNHCR, the United Nations Human High Commission for Refugees, sorry. And the person who holds the #2 position at UNHCR is Clements. She's been there since 2015. She was previously in the US government working as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State on this very issue. So, the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees at the UN, Clements, let's welcome her on. So, as you all know, this is also a taping for Global Reboot. I'm going to get you to say a few words. How's your week been?
We're reaching the end now. So
yes.
This is a highlight of the week.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Excellent.
much.
Mine too. So assuming the audio is okay, I'm going to start our podcast. Clements, welcome to Global Reboot.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So let's begin with the very obvious question. How do you define a refugee?
So it has a very particular legal basis, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you that refugees can be fleeing conflict, they can be fleeing persecution, generalized violence, and then there's this category of a social group. So a refugee can be defined in very particular ways, but they are people that leave their original countries, cross an international border, and depending upon where you are, some of those regional contexts have actually very specific legislation to welcome them in as refugees.
And how many of them are there in the world?
You got it right. No, we talk about forcibly displaced people because you were making a distinction between those 35 million or so refugees, people that have left their country, and then those inside countries called internally displaced people who may be fleeing very similar reasons, but they don't leave their homes. They don't leave their home countries. And in some contexts, Syria is an excellent example of that. Displaced people can be displaced once, twice, 3 times. And now you see the same thing in Ukraine. You've seen the same thing in Sudan, and so on. So, as you said, no one chooses to be a refugee. So people will try every way possible to stay within their home country until really they don't have another option. And so we see internally displaced first, and that's why the numbers are so much larger than refugees.
3 times.
Yes. And then, of course, desperation, the ability to seek asylum in another country, and they go often to those countries surrounding their home country. They don't, about 3/4 of them will stay in neighboring countries around their home country. They don't go further afield.
Well, I imagine many of them can't leave. It's not easy to cross borders.
No. And the refugees they really are like you and me. Some have means, some don't have means. In contexts that we work in, often you see those that have means leaving first, and maybe they go further because they have the wherewithal to do that. As conflicts increase and lengthen and become protracted, that's when you see those that really, truly have not been able to leave before coming out. And that has been the case, I think, in every refugee context that I've worked with.
So sketch this out for us. Where do we tend to find the most refugees globally?
Well, we find refugees in every part of the world. first off. But the largest populations of refugees have tended to be, well, now, of course, the Ukraine situation, where you have between 5 and 6 million people who are now mostly within Europe, but in other countries
and
as
Ukraine
well.
used to have a population of 44 million before the
This is
war.
a large number of
You're
people
looking
leaving.
at 15%.
Yes,
Wow.
yes. The Syrian situation, where again you have about 6.8 million internally displaced, but another 5 to 6 million refugees, most of course in Turkey, in Iraq, in Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt. The Myanmar situation, and a situation I know rather well, that was where I started my career 3 decades ago. 3 waves of Rohingya have left Myanmar over that period of time, 1978, 1992, and most recently in 2017. There are over 1 million now in Bangladesh. In the Horn of Africa, of course, now we see this tragedy unfolding in Sudan. Sudan was a host of refugees, well over 1 million before the war began. And you had South Sudanese refugees actually returning precipitously to South Sudan when the war broke out. But now there are some 4 million internally displaced Sudanese, newly in the last 5 months, and 1 million refugees. Most have gone to Chad, but also to South Sudan, Central African Republic, Ethiopia, Uganda. So, and then of course, in our hemisphere, here, Venezuela has been a big driver of displacement, both internally, but also in the region. And so Colombia has been a huge host. And you have displacement, of course, even closer to the United States. And then back to Asia, Afghanistan. And Afghanistan has been a country in conflict for 4 decades. And Pakistan and Iran have, of course, been generous hosts for those 4 decades. They, between them, host between 6 and 7 million Afghans. Not all of them are registered refugees, but some are undocumented. And then inside the country, of course, you have 3.5 million conflict displaced. And that's also a huge driver. So Turkey, for example, hosting both Syrians and Afghans and Iraqis in large numbers.
So that's sort of a global snapshot, but give us a sense of, let's say there's a big earthquake in country X, and then a large part of the population finds that it has to leave, and let's say they need to migrate to another country, a neighboring country, and you see this large refugee population build up all of a sudden. What does UNHCR do?
Yeah. So we're an agency that focuses on those that are fleeing for the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning, the persecution, conflict. But in some of these contexts, in particular, for an earthquake, let's take February, what happened in Turkey, and affecting a large portion of Syria as well. I happened to be in Iraq when the earthquake hit. I was going to Syria next. So ended up diverting, going to Aleppo, into that area where we already had a large relief operation that had been underway for 11 years in a country that has been under sanction, in the poverty rates increasing quite dramatically in Syria. What we did during that circumstance is we would obviously support the internally displaced that were part of that relief program that we've had in place, protection, aid, legal assistance, other ways that people can support themselves. And then we turned it into a very quick inject of, people were, the images of people standing and looking at buildings that actually you could not tell the difference of those buildings. Were they war damage or were they from the earthquake? But it was clear that it was from the earthquake. They were basically looking at their dwellings and wondering, okay, we have no homes now. What are we going to do? So trying to find emergency shelters so people weren't sleeping in parks, trying to ensure that you had clean water, and we worked through the partners that we had for the relief operation quite extensively. And we did similarly in Turkey, because of course there was a huge refugee protection and aid program underway there with the government. And so we would convert in a situation like this, and when you have major earthquakes, if we're present, you know, you don't worry about mandates. You don't worry about, well, that's your job, or should we be asked, or what have you. We offer. It's a whole of UN approach, and we do what we can to save lives and minimize suffering, because it's just catastrophic. Similarly, what we've seen now just recently in Libya, and with the flooding, and with the 11,000 people lost, of which we have numbers that have confirmed 4,000 of them have perished, and some of them refugees or asylum seekers, because they were using Libya as this dangerous throughway to reach Europe on the Mediterranean. And we have programs inside the country that are trying to provide them, again, some assistance as they try to find a solution, a longer-term solution. So in this case, again, what did we have in our stocks? What could we give right away? What could we airlift? And in this case, we actually had a couple of airlifts that came through via our regional warehouse in Dubai. And we would do what we can to be able to support, you know, a country that was suffering, people that were suffering, and of course those that were being hosted in that country as well.
So, I mean, obviously that was an emergency example, but in general, globally, what are the biggest drivers of the creation of refugees? And I'm guessing that climate change has kind of steadily risen up that list of drivers. It is.
I think statistically, still conflict is the largest driver of displacement. But like you said, climate factors, climate change, natural disasters. Last year, there were 32 million people that somehow were displaced because of climate factors. It's quickly rising. And I think when we talk about drivers of displacement, we have, you know, there are 4 factors that we talk about. There, of course, conflict, climate, COVID, and aftermath people in terms of not having a way to be able to survive where they were, and cost of living and inflation. And we saw the ripple effect with Ukraine and what that meant for food insecurity, inflation in some of the areas we're working. And it's very hard to look at a population that's on the move and say it's only for that reason. It's only because there's a war in their original village, or it's only because they may be a member of a particular ethnic group that is persecuted. Increasingly, it's an overlay of multiple factors. And I think Venezuela is a good example of that. The conversations in the couple of times recently being in Colombia with Venezuelans about why they have left the country, it's a very complicated
because it's a big decision to make, to leave home.
Yes, and so you also have what we call mixed movements of people. People that may be going, people that are going because they're trying to save their life, because they're in harm's way, in danger. So it is very much an overlay, and you see this in the Sahel, you see this in the Horn of Africa. I was in July on the border with Ethiopia and Somalia. It's a place where we're providing some pretty innovative work for both Ethiopian farmers and Somali refugees, and they've been there for a couple of decades, working together to cultivate land and to provide food for communities. But now they have 250,000 drought victims that have come from Somalia or other parts of Ethiopia into the area to try to be assisted. So you have this, you know, very interesting mix of people on the move, but for different reasons. They're coming for water, they're coming for food, whereas those early Somali arrivals were coming because of war.
So in your role, when you think about fixing this gigantic, global, decades-long, centuries-long, millennia-long problem, how much of your mind space is on the emergency triage, and how much of it is in fixing the problem for the longer term?
oh, wouldn't we love it if those member states up the road could
We're going to
perhaps
get to that.
make a little peace?
Yeah.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing that a refugee would rather do is to go home.
Yeah.
To go home to a community that's safe again, they can rebuild, and that, I think, is the preferred option always. But as I mentioned, when you don't have a political resolution, you have people that have been in displacement or as refugees for years, going on generations. Some of those Afghans in Pakistan have been there for 40 years. Children born in Pakistan, they don't know Afghanistan. And so you really need to think differently about how you support a population. And so we've really done some creative work that needs to be redoubled going forward about how you don't look at a response just with a humanitarian lens. For UNHCR, we have primarily humanitarian funding coming our way, but increasingly some of the development banks, for example, have invested in longer-term resilience, trying to find some solutions where if people can't go home, and for a very small percentage of the population are resettled, but for the most part, people are staying where they are. How do they support themselves? How do they then think differently about their futures? They want a job. They want to put their kids in school. They want, adequate health care. They want clean water. I mean, these are basic things.
needs.
Security, obviously, which is why they remain where they are in many cases, is for that security. So we have partnered now, and this is where a lot of our work is generated. I don't want to minimize the emergency response, because if I can just pause for a moment on that. The emergencies over the last couple of years, on average, we've responded to a new emergency every 2 weeks.
Wow.
And for that, there's with a declaration and additional resources and people and partners and so on to go and support what is the first response. And those are communities. Those are local communities that we need to support.
And this is an increasing frequency than in years past?
Huge increase.
Because of climate change?
And conflict.
And conflict.
And conflict. I would not say one over the other. The conflict has been quite substantial. Right now we have 23 active emergency declarations, some massive, related to Sudan, for example, now, or Ukraine, and Afghanistan, for that matter. And then 20 or so that are on the horizon, they're on the precipice, that we're quite concerned about them. You have Burkina Faso and Mali that are active emergencies in some places where access is almost impossible. But then you also have fragility within those countries and neighboring countries where this kind of instability could spread. So the emergency response is significant. But we're increasingly trying to turn that emergency response into something that looks very different. I'll give you an example. With Sudan, and with this 1 million refugees now leaving, new refugees, Chad already had 400,000 refugees before the war broke out. They now have almost 600,000 new Sudanese refugees. And of course, mostly they're at the border areas. We're trying to figure out ways with the government and local authorities. How do we help them move them to locations that are safer and where services can be provided? Trying to avoid camps. We really want alternatives to camps. And part of this support is now coming from the international financial institutions. The World Bank, for example, already had a huge partnership with the Chad government about reinforcing health and health and education services. So they've almost turned into an emergency development approach, where rather than looking at a parallel system of humanitarian relief, you immediately pivot to thinking, what does this population need? What do they want that we can help to provide so they are less dependent on international aid? Like I said, jobs. Can you put kids in school almost immediately? How do you provide that health care that they might need? Deeply traumatized individuals. All of that. Let's not have the international community kind of fly in and provide, but use those local resources and build on government structures to be able to provide. This is what we're trying to do in many parts of the world now. And if I could just pause for a moment on Ukraine, one of the systems that were put into place within days after the war breaking out by the European Union was a temporary protection that allowed people to work immediately, put their kids in school, and basically have a residency. And that gave them the tools to be able to support themselves. Colombia and Ecuador have done the same thing with Venezuelans, a residency permit so that they can work. So they are able to support themselves. And this is what we're trying to do then, trying to support the governments, to support those structures, as opposed to come in with a long-term relief operation that is neither effective nor efficient.
So we've spent some time now discussing the scope and scale of the problem. And this is obviously a problem that will keep reemerging. It's not a static issue. There will be more conflicts. There will be other reasons that will generate more refugees. But if we had to think about rebooting this issue, if you had to think about the things that we could reform or change to better address the global refugee crisis, what would you do?
Well, you know, I was thinking about this because we had a conversation this morning with a number of member states and partner agencies about the growing humanitarian gap in terms of financing. Because while we have record need around the world, an enormous budget that is undersubscribed, we also in the last year have had a record amount of support for the organization and for, you know, the work not just we are doing, but many partners are doing. But it's a narrow way to look at aid. It's a narrow way to look at support. It also is something where you need to take the decision making that may take place not so close to the places we work, but right down to the local level, to have refugees displaced making their own decisions, designing their own programs, implementing their own programs. And so we're trying to shift very much the way that we deliver. So it's a catchy term called localization.
Yep.
You know, where it's not UNHCR. It's the 1,100 partners we work with, of which 70 or 80% are actually national or local. And really trying to invest in refugee-led, women-led, community-based organizations as the primary deliverers of aid. So that's a shift, I think, that can only strengthen the response and can increase resilience in a community, and including those displaced populations. But there have to be very flexible funding mechanisms to be able to support this. And this is something that, you know, from a humanitarian perspective, the public sector that we get most of our support from, although increasingly from the private sector, they are flexible, but the humanitarian way of approaching this can be sometimes rigid in terms of time frame. So going back to a different approach, this emergency development or looking at solutions, you know, we need the financing mechanisms in order to support that. And you saw that with the World Bank when IDA 18 and then IDA 19 and now talking about 20, the host and refugee subwindow, where you then had obviously governments being able to ask for that kind of support through grant mechanisms for middle-income countries that were big refugee hosts, the global concessional financing facility, and again, another way of reinforcing, not in a short-term way, but the systems and the sectors of the country to be able to reinforce that. So you can do what you see now in Uganda, very progressive refugee policies. Refugees can move, they can work. You have Ugandan students in refugee schools, and you have refugee students in Ugandan schools. But you don't invest in a parallel system. You really try to reinforce. Not every mechanism, not every funding instrument is designed in a way that's flexible enough for us to be able to do that. So increasingly we have to look at this not as a humanitarian intervention or a development one, but something that's much more flexible. keeping in mind that there's a very specific way that we need to be able to deliver aid in a humanitarian way that's apolitical, neutral, and so on. But the financing itself can be much more flexible than it is.
I want to come back to that, but I also want to put a criticism to you. It is a criticism of the UNHCR and the UN system in general. And the criticism goes like this. You have a wide range of funders, but of those funders, there is a disproportionate amount of funding that comes from the United States. So I was looking at your website, and it showed that of the $3.4 billion that comes from a whole range of countries and some private donors, about $1.2 billion was coming from the United States. That's more than 33%. You look at the top 10, and you've got most of the G7 in the top 10. And then the criticism then is that these mostly rich, mostly Western countries, they often then say to UNHCR that, why don't you focus on the areas that matter to us? So for example, Europe or Ukraine, or in America's case, Central America or South America. So goes the criticism. And then a lot of the global South gets ignored, whether it's Africa, whether it's large parts of Asia. Do you think that that model is broken?
The United States has been an incredibly generous donor to our agency. Let me say that right off the top. But
and you, of course, worked for the U.S. government,
Yes.
but you're wearing your UNHCR hat.
I am.
Right.
But we are overly dependent on them. And we've had these conversations. And I think, in terms of the top 4, 5, 6 donors, they provide, of the public support we get, they provide between 70 and 80%.
Wow.
Which is enormous, which of course is not healthy. And we're not alone. This is something that's shared with my sister agencies. We need much more diversity of support. It's one of the reasons why, and getting back, and I can talk about the public sector here in a moment, but the private sector, one of the reasons we went to the private sector several years ago to really build up a strategy was several reasons. One, a clear financing gap, in terms of the kind of support they can provide that we can't find elsewhere. Second was the expertise and the innovation that they can help us drive, and I can give you some examples if we have time later related to that. And the third is the advocacy, and especially as we see refugees increasingly part of that polarized debate and becoming the other, business matters in terms of a voice. So
Sure.
to try to advocate for policies that are inclusive and humane and so on, that's very important. But we've tried to diversify, and actually 20% of our budget last year was filled by the private sector and individual givers. The public sector remains very focused on those few member states in particular. And that is something we're trying to diversify. It has been quite difficult. I think in numerical terms, the number of governments that are now providing to UNHCR has gone up year in and year out, but not to the scale that we need to try to meet a little bit of that gap.
Right. Your website also had a per capita contribution thing, and I saw Monaco was #1, which I'm sure adds up to nothing.
We love Monaco.
We love Monaco.
Monaco's contributions.
Very rich country. But I guess, part of the complaint here is that should donors have, by giving money, should they have the ability to sway what you do?
Well, the High Commissioner has a very particular mandate. And the way that our organization is set up, he reports back to the General Assembly. And that provides a level of independence. Also, with regard to what he's been asked to do by the General Assembly, there has to be a way that we provide a level of support to refugees displaced in need wherever they may be. And that kind of independence in terms of his mandate is very important to that. And I think we have We have a very healthy governance group, but it's over 100 member states. And you have a very strong voice in those governance discussions that we have from our host countries.
Yep.
And that, I think, is quite different, perhaps, than some of my sister agencies. And I think that makes for a healthy organization. Because when we talk about donors, and I want to say this first and very, very forthright, we're not just talking about the donors that provide us resources. The hosts are also donors.
Correct.
They've been doing this for decades. They're providing a global public good. They're keeping their borders open. They're doing the best they can, some of them with meager means, and they need much more support than they get. So that kind of the active discussions we have, you would not see us swayed in one way or the other,
right?
Because it makes it a very much an even playing field.
I guess the sense of inequality is that the rich Western countries write the checks, and then the countries that end up being the hosts for refugees, whose populations end up being bloated by refugee inflows, and then that ends up affecting their economies and the way their cities are populated and their supply of energy and food, and the ripple effects are immense. But those countries tend to be middle income or poorer, and that leads to a sense of injustice.
It's about 3/4 of refugees are hosted in low and middle income countries.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. It's one of the reasons, frankly, why the world came together in 2018 to establish this global compact on refugees. That was not just about refugees. That was very importantly also about hosts, and about the way that we look at a response, that it's not, you're not assisting just one part of the population. If you provide support, you're also providing it to the host communities too, because you know how much they have shouldered in terms of these additional guests and visitors and refugees who've been in their communities. So it has been an approach that we've looked at very intentionally, where it's about self-reliance for the refugees. It's about finding other solutions, including solutions that may not be in those host countries. Resettlement is one. Some of the scholarship programs we've done with education are another. We call them complementary pathways, other ways to be able to support and relieve the burden. But it's also about the kind of support in those communities, like these fragile services that may not be ready to have double the number of students in their classrooms, like we saw in the Middle East, or even in Pakistan and in Iran, where they need much more additional support. So that, of course, then has a much bigger community of actors involved, including those host countries, but also civil society, refugees, organizations, and others, in terms of being able to provide protection, aid, and find solutions. So it levels, I think, a little bit again the potential to see an organization sway in one direction or another, because we really don't. And the way that we construct our programs are really bottom up, and they're very much based on who the population is we're trying to serve, what the host communities may need, which actors are there. Do we need to bring in other actors for reinforcements, or do we have the kind of local and community support that we require? And so the budget is built that way and up. So in terms of being able to present that, when you see a budget that we have like we do now, which is almost $11 billion, that's a needs-based budget. That's not necessarily what we're going to get. In fact, we don't receive that amount, but it's quite balanced region to region.
I want to come to the private sector in a moment, because I think that's a very exciting area to discuss. But one more public sector question, and I think this is relevant, important. It's come up in every discussion I've had this week, since this is the high-level leaders week at UNGA. Do you think the UN is broken right now? Is it paralyzed? The leaders of China, Russia, the UK, France, India, none of them are here. There's a growing sense that even the United States is increasingly focused on bilateral and regional arrangements, whether it's the G7, whether it's the Quad, whether it's AUKUS. Other countries in the Global South seem very energized right now by the G20, for example, which has just included the African Union in that group. We're moving to a world of clubs, really. And then here we are at the UN this week. Is the UN fit for purpose today?
It's a big question.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I would put the UN all in one basket.
Fair.
I think, you know, from a political perspective, to go back to our earlier conversation, the political structure is not coming to the table and making decisions that are based on consensus, that are based on a solidarity and a mutual purpose and a mutual objective. That's very clear. There is, I think, you know, within the world that we operate in, you do have a UN that is paying much more attention to the impact of that paralysis in a political sense on the people of the world. I mean, we've been talking about this extensively this week. The reboot of the SDGs, for example.
I love that you're using that word now.
The rescue plan, the global rescue plan that the Secretary General talks about and how important that is. And, you know, some of the indicators that we were talking about, COVID accepted, I think we slid back a bit, particularly on education and some of the health indicators, of course. But there also has been substantial steps forward, you know, on some of the economic growth indicators and the like. Does it need a fix and a reform? And I feel like, you know, in a way, we're doing nothing but reform. And I think the global context is such, and the financial picture, and what we're hearing, obviously, by some of those governments, we are going to have to continue to change. I mean, what did one say once upon a time? Change is competency. It's not an event. So if you put reform and change kind of in that basket, yes, we need to keep moving. We need to keep looking at these instruments that can actually meet the needs of people. We need to design things in a way where the power isn't centralized in a traditional structure, going back to the localization conversation. We do need to think differently about solutions in terms of, is it the traditional ways that we've always done it, or do we need to be doing things differently? And I think in many ways we are. So some do talk about a crisis of multilateralism, but I think what we've seen, and particularly in the context where I live currently, in Europe, if you don't have countries coming together to look at shared responsibility, you don't have a solution. So to do that, it's not a region that it hits. It's a global impact. I'll give you an example. I was in Brazil earlier this year. I stopped first in Sao Paulo and talked to Afghans who had come through the visa system to Brazil, and they were trying to make their way then north. And then I ended that trip with a visit to Darien, heartbreaking, and the number of asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants that are coming through very dangerous territories, and met more Afghans.
Wow.
You know, so it's not what's happening in South Asia or even in Europe. You know, what's happening in Afghanistan, in that part of the world, affects this part of the world. So absolutely necessary that we have a global look at displacement and people's needs and solutions.
So it's clear to me that one of the things that your organization needs is more money. Where does the private sector fit into this? And I keep hearing about things like leveraged finance and blended finance when it comes to not just organizations like yours, but also the World Bank and other groups that are looking to solve other big issues. So how are you looking at that problem?
I think that's me, and I'm not sure why.
Try lifting this a teeny bit.
Yeah.
Okay, and keep going. You know, I'm gonna interrupt for a second. Would you like to take a look at what's? Okay, let's do that.
I'm just gonna adjust this. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yeah, please do. This is the best thing about tapings. You can cut.
Anybody need to stand up for a little break?
It's better that this is audio. When I was a TV producer, there was an anchor who shall go unnamed, who would often stop interviews, and then he'd just say, "Oh, it's the magic of TV. Like the producers will fix it." Of course, with video, it's really hard to fix it. So, but with audio, it is easier. And as I say this, I'm sure our producer, who isn't here, is going to kill me for saying that. You're going to change the battery? Is that it?
Was it something I said? Crisis of multilateralism? Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
In the meantime, we're going to do that.
All right.
Okay.
Sounds fine.
All right. We have a fix. So the question, I'm not going to re-ask that whole thing, but private finance, how are you using it to sort of leverage and expand what you do?
So I was mentioning earlier, the private sector, we've looked at it in a number of ways. And from a perspective of a humanitarian agency, there are a number of avenues that we're looking at on the private sector side, from some of the expertise elements, but also when we look at different ways of financing what we think needs to happen in a particular context. And I'll give you an example. Maybe we can link it back to climate. And for climate, there are a couple of components that we're looking at. Operational delivery. How do we do things differently? You saw, for example, in the case of a million Rohingya going to Bangladesh, in those months right after, in 2017, all you saw was sparse hills, no trees, nothing. We quickly put into place something that we think now could be potentially scaled up on a refugee environmental protection fund, which basically takes, tree planting with clean energy like LPG, and then allowing carbon credits to be purchased, then sustaining this kind of support. So it's not something that you need to have additional capital come in for both the environmental purposes, but also for clean cooking and general support. But it's those sorts of innovative financing mechanisms that we think are possible. We've done similar things with some of the development banks, including, for example, with the Islamic Development Bank, using Waqf and non-Waqf sources. The capital that is necessary at the beginning, that then becomes revolving, that we can then use to be able to provide support in some of the operations in a way that you then aren't looking at a program injection needing an emergency appeal that's then been responded to be able to move. You've got already in a bank a guarantee that we can then access those funds because of the capital that then has been built up. We've used some of these sorts of techniques in terms of some of the financing that's required. It's still relatively modest, to be honest, but there's potential there. And one of the ways where we see the relationship with the private sector building is in the collaboration that we've had with the International Financial Corporation. And that we now have the kind of empirical evidence that we need that if you have investment in refugee areas and host communities, that you actually see the per capita of that community increasing, which has meant then more investment from those businesses and more investment from the banks in terms of being able to provide whatever service might be required in that area. So I think from the private sector side, some of them are, and we've heard a lot about tech and AI and that sort of thing. It equally applies in the refugee context through things like predictive analytics. How do we know what's coming in terms of the weather patterns? How can we see areas where there might be potential for a spark of a local conflict that then spreads? the overlay of some of those areas, to know we've done some serious work in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa to be able to predict the people's movements, to be able to then pre-position, to be able to support more easily. That would not have been possible without the private sector. There are a number of those areas that.
And that's a growing part of the pie now?
Yes. Well, so last year, of course, Ukraine was a big factor. I mean, we raised $1.2 billion from the private sector. Our strategy had been to exceed $1 billion by 2026. So this year, it's not looking so good in terms of both the public support but also private support.
Because interest in Ukraine is waning?
Yes, it's one of those, as we talked about earlier. You have a lot of interest at the beginning in an emergency. If it's a natural disaster or a major event like this one has been. But you have to keep focus, and you need to keep attention by individuals but also businesses on why it matters to continue to engage and to support this kind of action.
You know, over the course of this conversation, I feel like you've mentioned maybe 10 countries that you've visited in the last year. I would not like to look at your sort of flight schedule calendar. That's probably very scary. But you see a lot of suffering. You see a lot of hard times for a lot of people in a lot of parts of the world. What gives you hope?
The stories of people I talk to, and regardless of their suffering or their experience, they are always thinking about the future. And I'll give you a couple of examples. You know, I met this Ukrainian woman on the outskirts of Kyiv called Helena, and she was taking care of her husband, who did not have the wherewithal to take care of himself. And we were making some little fixes to her windows that had been impacted from some of the shelling in from the earlier parts of the war. You know what she was telling me? She was most angry that her greenhouse had been shelled, so she couldn't grow her hothouse tomatoes to be able to provide for the community, because she was one of the community farmers. Yeah. So how quickly could she get those hothouse tomatoes growing again to add to the apples, where we went in her backyard and she picked some apples and gave them to us? I mean, regardless, she spent 6 weeks down in a cellar with her husband. And yet, just a few weeks later, we're having this conversation about her growing her crops again. Or, you know, Pascaline, this Congolese refugee I met in Burundi last year, who had domestic violence, then sexual violence en route from Congo to Burundi. She became a community leader. So she was mobilizing. She had a whole group of other community leaders to go and provide health information to other refugees in the camps. And she was making these connections with the Burundi local community, so that, you know, in terms of building ties between, these are the sorts of conversations that I just, you know, they stay with me for a very, very long time. And I haven't mentioned this in this conversation yet, but we have an opportunity actually in December, which is the Global Refugee Forum. And this is where we springboard forward on things like climate adaptation, mitigation, education, some of the solutions we've been talking about, and those sorts of things. What's at the center? It's refugee, displaced, and stateless voices. They're the ones that are driving our agenda, and they're the ones that we need to be listening to. And that's what gives me hope.
Thank you for doing what you do. It's really, really important, and the world needs it. And the work you do every day clearly makes such a huge difference. Kelly Clements, thank you for joining us. And that was our taping of Global Reboot. Thank you for being such a great audience and being quiet throughout. Now you can make some noise, but before you do, I would like to invite on stage one of our partners for this event, and his name is John Hennessy Nyland. He is a former U.S. ambassador, and he's a professor at the Bush School at Texas A&M. He's going to say a few words, but then afterwards, I would love it if you could all join us for a beverage right out the back. Thanks again for joining us. John Hennessy Knighting.
Thank you, Ravi. Such a wonderful innovator, connector of people, and such a gracious host. Thank you so much. To Kelly, thank you so much for your insights and perspective on the challenge of global refugees. It's something I also worked on earlier in my career when I was actually seconded by the U.S. State Department to be part of the team that went into the Balkans immediately in the early part of the conflict under Secretary Albright. So thank you for all that you do. Speaking of a global reboot, I recall when I served at the White House at the National Security Council, where I was the yak to the U.S. Sherpa at the time of the global financial crisis. And the decision was taken to reboot the G20 from a finance ministers meeting to an annual meeting of the leaders of the 20 largest world economies. And I think that reboot has been successful. I'm also pleased that Ravi mentioned SPEC, the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, former Secretary of State. While I was the U.S. Ambassador in Palau, I was able to play host to Our Ocean Conference, which was also an effort to reboot how we think about climate, because before, the oceans were sometimes neglected and are so important in any discussion of climate. The Bush School of Government and Public Service is hosting the reception tonight with our partner, the Doha Forum. And I will keep my remarks brief because I realize I stand between you and the drinks. And as an ambassador, I know that is not a great place to be. But as a personal aside, I was fortunate enough to be in Doha last year for the World Cup. And I want to congratulate Qatar for such a wonderful event. And I trust the upcoming Doha Forum later this year will also be a great success. Tonight, though, I trust that you will enjoy some warm Texas A&M hospitality here in the heart of New York City. Just a few words about the Bush School. It was named after our 41st president, George H.W. Bush, who truly believed that public service is a noble calling. And at the Bush School, we are nonpartisan, and we strive to combine theory with practice and to equip and hopefully inspire our students for a career in public service. And we very much hope that we provide them the insights, the perspective, and the tools needed to grapple with some of the world's most complex challenges. And yes, if needed, to come up with innovative and creative solutions to reboot policy if necessary. I also want to mention that the Bush School is relatively young, 25 years old, but we are very proud of our most recent ranking by U.S. News and World Report in the top 20% of public affairs institutions here in the United States. Lastly, I do want to note again our interest in having any of you come down to Texas, to College Station. The Bush School is obviously part of Texas A&M University, but we also have a teaching center in Washington, D.C. And I'd be happy to talk to you about either places during the reception. So lastly, thank you so much. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you to the team at Foreign Policy and Doha Forum, and to our team here from Texas A&M and the Bush School. So without any further ado, I did say I would be brief, and I'd like to keep to my word. I invite you to join us at the reception that follows. Thank you so very much.